Hey guys, do you know about the story of Medusa, the woman whose name is still feared across the ages? Her transformation, from a beautiful mortal to a monster with snakes for hair, and the power to turn anyone who meets her gaze into stone. This isn't just any tale, it's a story of love, revenge, and a goddess's wrath. You probably won't survive this one, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're in the mood, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. Maybe it's your midnight and we can share a strange night together now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're Medusa, once known for her golden locks, her radiant beauty that seemed to outshine even the sun itself. She was a mortal, but admired by all, even by the gods themselves. But one goddess, Athena, the ever-distant protector of wisdom and war, looked upon Medusa with a jealousy that had been simmering for ages. Medusa's beauty wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol of everything. Athena couldn't be. Medusa was everything Athena feared. She was the very thing that made Athena's own divine form feel distant, cold, and untouchable. But it wasn't just beauty that made Medusa dangerous to Athena, it was her very presence. Medusa didn't belong to any man, any god. She was a free woman in every sense of the word, that terrified Athena. The moment came in the temple of Athena, when Medusa was standing before the goddess, as a simple mortal worshipping with devotion, never suspecting the fate that awaited her. Historians still argue about what exactly happened next. Some claim it was a mere accident. Others believe Medusa was manipulated into making a choice that would seal her fate. But what's clear is this: Medusa was not the aggressor in the situation. And yet it was she who would pay the price. It wasn't some mortal lover who turned Athena's heart to stone. It was the jealousy of a goddess who felt overshadowed by a mortal girl's beauty, who felt threatened by the very light that radiated from Medusa's presence. Athena cursed Medusa. She transformed her into a monster, something grotesque and horrifying beyond comprehension. Medusa's golden hair turned into writhing serpents, and her once perfect features were twisted into a grotesque mask of fury. From that moment on, Medusa was no longer welcome in the world she had once graced. She was cast out, banished to the farthest reaches of the earth, where she would live in isolation, surrounded only by the monsters of the world. But it wasn't just a physical transformation that hurt Medusa, it was the psychological toll of it all too. She wasn't just an outcast. She was a symbol of divine wrath, and her every breath became a reminder of the vengeance Athena had unleashed on her. And you might think that's where the story ends, but in truth, it's only just beginning, because Medusa's journey didn't stop with her transformation. She still had a role to play in the ancient world, and that role would bring her face to face with the very gods who had condemned her. The curse was far from over. It was only the beginning of a tragedy that would stretch across centuries and echo through every corner of the ancient world. You've heard of gods losing their tempers before, right? But you can't truly grasp the depth of Athena's rage until you witness what she does to Medusa. When a goddess like Athena is offended, it's not just a punishment, it's a cataclysmic event. You feel the tension as Athena's fury seeps into every corner of the world, her anger as cold and unforgiving as the steel of a spear. Medusa, standing in the sacred temple, had no idea she was about to become a pawn in the goddess's twisted game. The temple was a place of reverence, where mortals would come to give thanks to Athena, seeking her favor, offering their prayers. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a space of protection and wisdom. But for Medusa, the moment she stepped into the goddess's presence was the moment everything changed. Scholars debate whether Athena's fury was truly provoked, or if it was a simmering jealousy that had built over time. Some claim Medusa's beauty was an unwitting challenge to Athena's divine authority, while others whisper that Athena couldn't stand seeing a mortal so beloved by the gods, especially when she, the goddess of wisdom, found herself so distant from their adoration. Whatever the case, Athena's rage was volcanic, sudden, and violent. One moment Medusa was on her knees, a humble mortal in the temple, and the next she was screaming as her beautiful locks began to twist, snake-like tendrils sprouting from her scalp. Medusa's skin burned as if she were being dipped into molten metal, her perfect face contorting into a monstrous, terrifying mask. Her hands reached for her head, but the serpents were already sinking their fangs into her flesh. You feel the horror of it all, not just because of the grotesque physical change, but because this curse wasn't just a punishment, it was a death sentence. Athena didn't just curse Medusa to be ugly, she cursed her to be feared, to be alone. The goddess didn't just strip Medusa of her beauty, robbed her of her humanity. Medusa was no longer a person. She was a monster, a warning. Athena, standing there in all her divine majesty, showed no remorse. In fact, there was a cold satisfaction in her eyes as Medusa writhed in agony. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological too. Medusa wasn't just disfigured, was forsaken. Every moment after the curse was a reminder that Athena had watched her fall from grace, and with that fall, Medusa became the embodiment of the goddess's anger. You wonder, if you had been there, what you would have done. How would you have reacted to the goddess's rage? Would you have stood in awe, or tried to intervene? But no one could stop Athena, not then, not now. Her power was unchallenged, and she had decreed that Medusa's fate was sealed. Athena didn't just punish Medusa, she made an example of her, a lesson to all mortals who might think they could rise above their place in the world. Beauty and grace were fleeting. Power, however, was eternal. Athena knew that, and she wielded it with the coldness only a goddess of war and wisdom could understand. Medusa, now transformed, would never again see the world as she once had. She was to be cast out, banished to the darkest corners of the earth. Her beauty and her humanity forever lost. Medusa's screams echoed through the temple, but Athena remained silent. The curse was done, and with it, any trace of mercy was erased. Historians still debate whether Athena ever regretted what she did to Medusa. Some believe that Athena's anger was justified, a divine retribution for the mortal's sin. Others argue that the goddess's wrath was disproportionate to the offense, that Medusa was only a pawn in a game far beyond her control. But what's clear is this: Athena's decision to punish Medusa was not one born of justice, it was a manifestation of divine jealousy, and Medusa, she would be forced to live with the consequences of Athena's rage, far away from the world she once knew. The curse was her new reality, and nothing, not even time, could take it away. 3. The curse was only the beginning for Medusa. The physical pain of her transformation was unimaginable, but it was the loss of herself that truly shattered her. One moment, she was a mortal woman, adored for her beauty, loved by many, even by some of the gods. The next, she was something else, an alien, unrecognizable monster, bound to a fate no one could have predicted. Her hair, once golden and lustrous, now writhed with serpents, each one hissing with malice. Medusa's hands trembled as she touched her face. Her skin burned, and every part of her that had once been familiar seemed foreign, alien. No longer was she the captivating woman who had inspired the admiration of men and gods alike. She had become a grotesque creature, her eyes now capable of turning anyone who looked upon her to stone. And it wasn't just the external changes that tormented her. Inside, she felt the very fabric of her identity unraveling. Who was she now? What was she now? Athena's curse had taken everything: her beauty, her connection to the world, her humanity, and replaced it with fear, hatred, and loneliness. Imagine what that would feel like. To see your reflection in a pool of water and not recognize the face staring back at you. Imagine the moment when you realize that the world you once knew will never accept you again, and that your very gaze will turn those who dare to look upon you into stone statues. It wasn't just her appearance that had changed. The heart, once full of warmth and innocence, now grew colder with each passing day. The snakes that coiled around her head began to echo the growing venom in her own soul. The beauty she had once cherished now seemed like a cruel joke, something Athena had given her, only to take away. You feel her anguish. How could she go on when the very thing that had once made her whole had now become her curse? With every step, Medusa's world became smaller. Her once cherished connection to the world was severed. The gods she had once been admired by now turned their backs on her, seeing her only as a monstrosity. She was cast into isolation, forced to live in the darkness, away from the world she had known. Historians debate the true nature of Medusa's curse. Some say it was a punishment for an act she had committed. Others suggest Athena was merely a jealous goddess who sought to tear down a mortal who had too much power over the hearts of men. But in Medusa's mind, there was no question. This was the punishment of a goddess who had decided that beauty and freedom were sins to be erased. Medusa wandered the desolate places of the world, her every step haunted by the weight of her curse. The few mortals who crossed her path fled in terror. At the sight of her, their faces frozen in horror as they turned to stone. She had no allies, no friends, no one to share her pain with. Even her reflection was a reminder of what she had lost. She was now more than a monster. She was a symbol of divine rage, a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the gods. Athena's curse had changed her forever, and Medusa was left to live with the consequences of a decision made by a goddess whose jealousy knew no bounds. Yet, amidst the darkness, a flicker of something remained inside Medusa. Something not completely lost to the curse. It was the smallest thread of who she once was, a part of her that refused to be extinguished. It wasn't hope, exactly, but a quiet determination to survive. If she was to be a monster, then she would at least be a monster who would survive. The world had cast her aside, but Medusa had not given up on herself entirely. She would learn to embrace this new form, this new existence, however monstrous it might be. For the world may have rejected her, but that didn't mean she had to reject herself. Medusa wandered far from the city, far from the people she once knew. But there was one place she couldn't leave behind, Temple of Athena. It wasn't just the place where everything had begun, where her life had been shattered by a single, divine decision. It was the one place in the world where she felt some strange connection to who she had been, to the woman she once was. You feel the weight of it too. The temple stands before you, a towering structure that once symbolized wisdom, beauty, and the power of the gods. Now, for Medusa, it stands as a silent monument to her suffering. Athena's wrath had twisted it into something dark, but it was still a place of memories. The cold marble floors, the grand pillars reaching toward the sky, the scent of incense, still faintly lingering in the air of everything, felt like it was frozen in time, as if it was waiting for her to return. But returning wasn't as simple as stepping inside. The moment Medusa's foot touched the sacred grounds, she could feel the weight of Athena's gaze upon her. Even in her exile, even in her monstrous form, Athena's presence lingered like a suffocating cloud. It was as though the very air in the temple still held the remnants of that curse, the anger and betrayal that had shattered Medusa's life. Historians still argue whether Medusa's return to the temple was an act of defiance or one of desperation. Some believe she came seeking answers, a way to understand why Athena had cursed her, while others argue that Medusa had come to the temple to die, to confront the goddess who had torn her life apart. But what's clear is this: Medusa didn't just want answers, wanted something more. She wanted Athena to see her, not as a monster, not as a punishment, but as the woman she had once been. Medusa wanted Athena to remember the woman she had been before the curse, the woman who had worshipped her, the woman who had believed in the goddess's wisdom. But there was no forgiveness to be found in the temple. There were no answers waiting for her. Just a hollow silence, the cold gaze of the goddess, and the weight of a curse that refused to let her go. And so, Medusa wandered through the temple, her footsteps echoing in the stillness, each step a reminder of the life she had lost. The sacred halls, once a place of reverence, now felt like a tomb, a place of mourning for what could have been. The walls were lined with statues, some of gods and goddesses, some of mortals who had come to honor Athena. But as Medusa looked at them, she couldn't help but feel that these statues were her only company now, her only connection to the world she once belonged to. In one corner of the temple stood a statue of Athena herself, a towering figure carved from white marble, her eyes filled with cold wisdom. Medusa had admired this statue once, had even prayed before it, hoping for the goddess's favor. But now, standing before it, all she felt was bitterness. Athena had given her the curse that had destroyed her life, had turned her into something unrecognizable. The statue was no longer a symbol of reverence, it was a reminder of the goddess who had abandoned her. Medusa had come here seeking answers, but there were none to be found. Athena had cast her aside, and the temple, once a place of hope, now felt like a tomb. It was a painful truth to confront it. Athena would never see her as the woman she had been. She would always be a monster, a symbol of Athena's wrath. But as Medusa stood there, staring at the statue of the goddess, something shifted inside her. The rage she had felt before, the anguish, the helplessness, it began to melt away, replaced by something else, acceptance. She would never be what she had been before, and Athena would never forgive her. But that didn't matter anymore. Medusa had to let go of the woman she had been and embrace the creature she was becoming. She would survive, with or without Athena's approval. She would carve out a new existence in this world, even if it meant living in the shadow of the goddess who had cursed her. Medusa turned away from the statue, her serpents hissing softly as she made her way back into the darkness, leaving the temple behind. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was running from something. She was simply moving forward, step by step, into a future that was entirely her own. The further Medusa drifted from the temple, the more she felt the fracture in her soul widen. It wasn't just Athena who had abandoned her. It was the very world that had once welcomed her with open arms. She was alone now, in a way that transcended the physical distance she had traveled. She was alone in her own heart. The sisterhood she had once felt with Athena now shattered beyond recognition. You can feel the cold, too. That void where something once warm and familiar had been. It's a sharp ache, isn't it? To realize that the bonds you thought were unbreakable are gone. To understand that the one person who had once understood Yayuan, who had once been a companion, a guide, and a protectress, now your enemy. Medusa knew that feeling all too well. She had once been close to Athena, not just as a mortal worshipper, but as a woman who had shared a connection with the goddess that went beyond the divine. There had been a time when Athena had not just been her patron, but her confidant. Medusa remembered the moments they had shared in the temple, the quiet conversations, the times when Athena had offered her wisdom and guidance. Back then, Athena had been a figure of strength, but also one of warmth. There had been a sisterhood, a bond of trust that had felt as solid as the marble pillars of the temple. But all of that had changed the moment Athena's jealousy turned into wrath. The goddess's decision to curse Medusa hadn't just been an act of punishment, it had been a betrayal of everything they had shared. Medusa wasn't just cursed. She was abandoned by the only divine figure who had ever given her a sense of purpose and belonging. Historians still argue whether Athena's anger toward Medusa was justified. Some claim that Athena, as a goddess of wisdom and strategy, saw Medusa's beauty as a threat to her own power, while others suggest that Athena's actions were rooted in a deeper jealousy, something far more personal than mere rivalry. Regardless of the reasoning, what's undeniable is that the curse tore apart any semblance of the bond they had once shared. Now, Medusa wandered alone through the world, carrying the weight of that loss with her every step. The very thought of Athena brought a bitter taste to her mouth, but at the same time, Medusa could not erase the memory of the goddess she had once admired, the one she had once looked up to as a sister. That memory was a double-edged sword, something that cut both ways. It was painful to remember the connection they had once had, but it was equally painful to accept that it was gone. You wonder, don't you, how long it takes to heal from a wound like that? Can someone ever really let go of the love they once felt for another person? Medusa didn't know. She couldn't even begin to understand what it meant to forgive someone who had condemned you to such a fate. But she also knew that she could never move forward until she let go of the past. The memories of Athena, of their time together, would haunt her forever if she didn't find a way to move on. And so, Medusa found herself in the wilderness, far away from the world she had known, struggling to reconcile the image of the goddess she had once adored with the reality of the goddess who had destroyed her life. Medusa had been cast aside by Athena, but in her own way, she would have to cast aside the memory of the woman who had once been her sister. It was the only way to survive, but it wasn't easy. No, the pain of that loss lingered. There were moments, brief ones, when Medusa would catch herself thinking about the old times, when Athena had been the shining beacon of wisdom, when she had been a source of comfort and strength. But those moments never lasted long. The curse, the serpents, the coldness of her new existence Scythe were always there, waiting to remind Medusa of what had been taken from her. Medusa had lost her sister, and now she had to find a way to live in a world where she no longer had a place. Beauty had been Medusa's blessing and her curse. It was a gift that had made her the subject of desire and admiration, a trait that had set her apart from others. Men, gods, even the world itself had been drawn to her. But beauty, as Medusa learned too late, had a dark side. There's a reason they say beauty is fleeting, right? Because in the end, it isn't the beauty that matters. It's the price that comes with it. Medusa's beauty had opened doors, but it had also built walls. She was adored, but she was also seen as a prize to be won, a treasure to be claimed. Her every movement was scrutinized, her every glance analyzed. It wasn't enough to be loved. She was expected to be flawless. The slightest imperfection would have ruined the illusion, and the world had no tolerance for imperfection in someone as beautiful as Medusa. It wasn't just the men who desired her. Athena, too, had been aware of the power that Medusa's beauty held. But unlike the others who had lusted after her, Athena had seen beauty as something more dangerous, a tool that could easily topple even the most carefully constructed divine order. Athena's wrath was as much a consequence of Medusa's beauty as it was of her. Challenged to the goddess's authority, Medusa's beauty had been a weapon, but it was also a weapon that would turn on her. It had lured people in, and once they were captivated, it made them blind to everything else. She had been reduced to her appearance, her golden hair, her bright eye suntle. That was all anyone saw. Men had fallen in love with her, gods had claimed her, and in the process, Medusa had lost herself. She was no longer a person to them, she was a prize, a symbol of unattainable perfection. Historians still debate how much Medusa's beauty contributed to her downfall. Some argue that if she had been less beautiful, she wouldn't have caught the eye of Poseidon, and therefore, Athena's wrath would have never been provoked. Others believe it was her beauty that made her stand out to Athena. In the first place, as the goddess of wisdom saw Medusa as a threat to her own divine image. The beauty that had once been a blessing had become the thing that set her on the path to destruction. You can see it now, can't you? That beauty, once radiant, now darkened by the curse that transformed her. Her serpent's hiss as she walks, and the once smooth skin is now hardened, cracked by the weight of her curse. The beauty that had once been her calling card is now the thing that makes others run in terror. Medusa's beauty is no longer a gift. It is a reminder of what she has lost. But that's the thing about beauty, it's a commodity in a world that never stops trading. You don't get to decide when it's taken from you. You don't get to decide if it becomes your strength or your downfall. Beauty is an illusion, and like all illusions, it is subject to the whims of the world around it. Medusa had been made to understand this harsh truth. Beauty doesn't protect you. It doesn't keep you safe. It doesn't save you from the gods or from the harsh realities of life. It only makes you vulnerable, because the moment people stop seeing you as human and start seeing you as a symbol, you are no longer in control. Think about your own life for a moment, about how much of your worth is tied to how others see you. The pressure to look a certain way, to present a version of yourself that others will accept, even admire. It's a strange kind of captivity, isn't it? Medusa knew that feeling all too well. Her beauty was both her armor and her prison, and now, with the curse placed upon her, Medusa could only reflect on the consequences of that beauty. The men who had once adored her, the gods who had sought Herald, were gone, leaving her with nothing but the weight of what she had been. The beauty that had once been her strength had turned into a symbol of her fall from grace, and now it was a feature that could never be hidden. Medusa couldn't undo the curse, and she couldn't turn back time. All she had was the pain of remembering what had been, and the harsh reality of what she had become. Beauty, as it turned out, had always come at an unseen price. The question remained, could she ever find a way to live with it? Could she accept the curse and embrace the monstrous figure she had become, or would she forever be haunted by the memory of the beauty she had once held? It's a question without an answer, and Medusa would have to find her own way forward, regardless of the past that still clung to her like a shadow. It was under the moon's pale light that Medusa found herself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The quiet, desolate wilderness around her felt like the only place where she could think clearly, away from the eyes of gods and mortals alike. The moon, always constant, always watching, felt like a distant friend, now a silent witness to her suffering. You feel the cool breeze, don't you? The one that brushes against your skin in the dead of night, when everything is still, and the world seems to hold its breath. That's the kind of night it was when Medusa stumbled upon the truth. She was walking along a rocky cliffside, the sound of waves crashing below, when she felt If's presence of something ancient, something older than even the gods themselves. It was as though the earth itself whispered to her, pulling her toward the edge of the world. Medusa had wandered far from any mortal settlement, far from the memories of her past life. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, the air was thick, with something that made her pulse quicken. You might think this is where she encounters some divine messenger, or maybe a god who will offer her a chance for redemption. But no, this was a revelation that had nothing to do with the gods. It was about Medusa herself. Historians debate the nature of the visions Medusa had that night. Some say she was simply succumbing to madness, her mind unraveling after years of isolation and torment. Others claim that, in that moment, the truth of the universe itself spoke to her. Either way, what happened next wasn't something that could be easily explained. As Medusa stood at the cliff's edge, her eyes fixed on the reflection of the moon on the water below, something inside her stirred. The snakes that once writhed on her head had become strangely still. The air around her seemed to shift, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a monster. She felt something else. In the stillness, she began to understand something that had eluded her for years. It wasn't just Athena who had wronged her. No, it was something deeper. Medusa had always thought of herself as a victim of Athena's wrath, but the truth was more complicated. Medusa had always been beautiful, but that beauty had been her armor and her curse. It had made her someone to be admired, yes, but it had also made her someone to be feared. The world's obsession with her appearance had never been about who she was, it had always been about what she could represent. She had never been allowed to just be. She had always been a symbol, an object of desire, a thing to be owned. And it wasn't just the gods who treated her this way, it was the entire world. Medusa had been molded into something she wasn't, and Athena's curse had been the final break. But as the moonlight bathed her, Medusa saw something else. She saw herself not as a victim, not as a creature trapped in her own skin, but as someone who had been denied agency her entire life. Athena's curse had twisted her, yes, but it had also given her something. It had given her power. Historians still argue whether Medusa's transformation into a monster was entirely the work of Athena's curse, or if Medusa herself played a role in her own change. Was she a passive victim, or did she choose, in some way, to embrace the curse and make it her own? Some claim that in those quiet moments under the moon, Medusa realized that she didn't have to be a victim anymore. She could be something else, entirely. It was then, in the stillness of that night, that Medusa made a choice. She would no longer be defined by the curse or by Athena's anger. She would no longer be a passive figure in a world that had never truly seen her. She would become something new, forced to be reckoned with, a symbol not of beauty or tragedy, but of survival. You might think this moment of clarity came as a sense of peace, but no. It was raw, visceral, a realization that she had been forced to survive by any means necessary. She had been cast aside by gods and mortals alike, but now, in this moment, she was no longer going to live in their shadow. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, but the change in Medusa remained. The next step in her journey was not to seek redemption or forgiveness from the gods. It was to understand that she was no longer a creature of the gods' whims. She was something else entirely, and she would carve out a new existence for herself. One where she would no longer need to prove her worth to anyone. The moon above seemed to approve of this new path, casting its light on the cliffside as Medusa walked away from the place where her old self had died. The world ahead of her was vast, unknown, and dangerous, but it was hers to claim. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was all that Medusa could hear as she walked through the darkened wilderness. The weight of her decision, of her newfound resolve, still hummed in her chest like the vibrations of a distant storm. It was the calm before the tempest. The world had no idea what it was about to face. Historians still debate whether Medusa ever truly embraced her monstrous form willingly. Some claim she remained shackled by the memory of her former self, forever tormented by the curse that had stolen her beauty and humanity. Others believe that the moment under the moonlight was the turning point when Medusa, no longer a victim, chose to harness the power that Athena's wrath had bestowed upon her. Regardless of what the truth might be, one thing was certain: Medusa had a new purpose now. She was no longer a passive figure in her own story. The sound of footsteps crunching the dirt underfoot disrupted the silence of the night. Perseus, the man sent by the gods to kill her. You know his name, don't you, Perseus, the mortal hero, destined to slay Medusa and bring back her head as a trophy for King Polydex. He was the one who would end her monstrous existence and, in doing so, earn his place among the heroes of legend. His fate was intertwined with hers, though neither of them knew it yet. Perseus had been tasked with the impossible, to find Medusa and kill her, but the gods had given him tools to help: a reflective shield from Athena, a sword forged by Hephaestus, and the sandals of Hermes to fly through the skies. The gods, ever the manipulators, had ensured that Perseus would succeed, but success came at a cost. As Perseus made his way toward the distant cliffs, he had no idea of the creature waiting for him. Medusa had been in hiding, retreating deeper into the shadows of the world, biding her time, learning to control the fury within her. She had been hunted, but now, for the first time, she was ready to face the hunter. You can almost see it, can't you? Perseus, confident in his divine gifts, stepping forward into the unknown. He's close now. He can feel the weight of the task ahead of him, God's expectations, the pressure to succeed. But what he doesn't know is that Medusa is waiting for him, not as a victim, but as a force that will challenge everything he believes about himself and the world he has been chosen to protect. The tension between them crackles in the air. Medusa, the monster, the cursed woman who has been driven to the edges of the earth. Perseus, the hero, the chosen one. Both are trapped by fate, but only one will walk away from this confrontation alive. But something is different in this version of the myth. This isn't just a simple tale of heroism and villainy. The gods may have decreed that Perseus will slay Medusa, but they had not anticipated the strength of the woman they had cursed. Perseus might have the divine tools at his disposal, but Medusa had something far greater. She had the fury of someone who had been betrayed, who had been cast aside, who had been forgotten by the gods. Historians have argued over why Perseus was able to defeat Medusa. Was it the reflection in Athena's shield that saved him? Was it the divine weapons he carried? Or was it something else cementing about the nature of Medusa's own power that made her vulnerable? Some say that Medusa, though cursed, had never truly been defeated by her own power. Perhaps it was the weight of the curse, the emotional toll of her transformation, that made her vulnerable to the hero's strike. Others argue that Medusa was more than a monster, was a goddess in her own right, a creature of immense power, who was ultimately undone by her own inability to control it. But in this moment, as Perseus approaches the cave where Medusa resides, none of that matters. The tension is palpable. The hunt has begun, and neither Medusa nor Perseus will be able to avoid the inevitable. Medusa stands, a figure of terror and resolve. She is no longer the woman she once was, and she is no longer the victim. She is a force to be reckoned with. Perseus may have the gods' favor, but Medusa has something else. The confrontation will be more than just a fight. It will be the battle between two opposing forces, the hero, who seeks glory, and the monster who has learned to wield her own power. But in the end, one of them will have to fall. As the world spun around her, Medusa stood at the precipice of something darker, something she hadn't anticipated. The anger, the sorrow, the loneliness, all of it, was beginning to twist inside her, like a living, breathing thing. The more she reflected on the world that had cast her aside, the more it seemed to break apart in her mind. What had once been anger toward Athena and the gods slowly began to dissolve into something more insidious. Madness. It wasn't just the isolation that had driven Medusa to this point. It wasn't just the weight of the curse that had deformed her, physically and mentally. It was the constant, unrelenting reminder that she was a monster, and worse, that she was the monster everyone feared. In the darkness of her cave, the truth clawed at her soul. She had been transformed, not by the gods, but by her own perception of herself. Historians debate whether Medusa's descent into madness was the result of her isolation, or if it was Athena's curse taking root deep inside her mind. Some claim that, with every passing year, Medusa grew more bitter, more detached from her past self, as her physical transformation became a mirror for her inner turmoil. Others suggest that the isolation, the loneliness, was simply too much for her to bear, and it was this emotional collapse that led to her unraveling. You can almost feel it, can't you? The slow, creeping madness that gnaws at your insides. The kind of madness that comes from being trapped in a cage, yet constantly staring into the abyss. For Medusa, that abyss was the reflection of her own cursed form. The face that had once been beautiful, and now only brought terror and despair. There was no escape. The world, even the gods, had abandoned her, and in her darkest moments, she began to believe she had nothing left to lose. It was during one of these moments, when she could feel the walls of her mind closing in, that Medusa began to hear voices. It was not the kind of voices that might speak to a rational person, or whispers, like the rustling of dead leaves on a long-forgotten path, pulling her deeper into herself. The voices murmured not of madness alone, but of revenge, of taking back what had been stolen. Her transformation wasn't just physical, it was mental, too. She could feel the anger simmering beneath her skin, the snakes on her head writhing more violently, the venom within them seeping into her veins. The more she gave in to the madness, the more her control over herself slipped away. She was no longer just Medusa, the woman cursed by Athena. She had become something far more dangerous. You might wonder, as you walk in her shoes for a moment, what it would be like to lose touch with reality, the way her thoughts would race, the way the memories of what she had once been, what she could have been, haunted her. The darkness of that cave mirrored the darkness inside her mind. It wasn't just the gods who had turned their back on her. Medusa had turned away from herself, no longer able to recognize the woman who had once walked through the world with grace. It wasn't just the snakes, either. It wasn't just the monstrous visage she now wore. Medusa had become something worse. A person who could no longer see the difference between the world around her and the storm of emotions brewing inside her. The maddening anger that Athena had unleashed within her was no longer something she could fight off. It was consuming. Her Medusa had once believed she could survive. She had once clung to the faint hope that some think change. But the longer she spent in isolation, the more that hope turned into something darker, something more dangerous. She no longer sought redemption. She no longer cared about forgiveness from the gods. She simply wanted the world to see her as she was: powerful, terrifying, untouchable. Historians argue whether Medusa had the chance to recover from this madness. If she had ever been given the opportunity to understand her new identity. Some say that had she accepted her fate, had she found a way to embrace the monster she had become, she might have been able to carve out a new path. But the madness, like a poison, had already begun to seep too deeply into her soul. The madness wasn't just her mind unravel, it was her body, too. The snakes became wilder, more uncontrollable. Her breath grew shallow, her vision blurred with rage. Medusa was no longer simply cursed. She was a force of nature, an embodiment of every pain she had ever felt, every betrayal she had ever suffered. And as the madness took root, it consumed her. She could feel it. Now the darkness that had once been her quiet companion had become her ally, urging her to let go. The more she gave in to it, the more she felt herself becoming untethered from reality. The world, once so vivid and full of color, had faded into a dull haze. All that remained were the jagged edges of her broken mind, a mind that had once been full of dreams and hopes, but now teetered on the edge of nothingness. And yet, even in her madness, something remained. It wasn't hope or clarity, but a strange kind of certainty. Medusa knew who she was now. She wasn't a victim, nor was she a hero. She was something in between, a force of nature that could never be tamed, a woman who had been lost and had found a new kind of power in her descent into the abyss. The hunt was drawing near, but by now it didn't matter whether Perseus found her or not. Medusa was no longer the woman who had once been beautiful. She had become something else entirely, and she would not go down without a fight. Medusa's life had been rewritten by Athena's cold hand, but Athena herself was not untouched by the consequences of the curse she had cast. Even gods were not immune to the ripples of their actions, and in the quiet spaces of her divine realm, Athena could feel the weight of what she had done. You might think that the gods live in some distant, unaffected space, never troubled by the lives of mortals or their own mistakes, but that's not true, is it? No one is truly immune to the consequences of their actions, not even the gods. Athena, with her wisdom and strategic mind, had always seen herself as above the chaos of human emotion. But Medusa had changed that. Athena, in her cold, calculating wisdom, had never expected the curse to take such a toll on Medusa or on herself. When Medusa had first been transformed, Athena had acted swiftly, decisively, to punish what she saw as Medusa's betrayal. The goddess had not expected to feel a pang of guilt as she watched the mortal woman unravel, nor had she anticipated the fury that would be born from Medusa's transformation. Historians debate the true nature of Athena's feelings toward Medusa after the curse. Some claim Athena felt no remorse, that the curse was simply a part of her divine sense of justice. Others suggest that Athena had underestimated Medusa's resilient height. The curse had backfired in ways Athena hadn't foreseen. Perhaps Athena had even thought, deep down, that Medusa would simply accept her fate and disappear into obscurity, forgotten by all. But Medusa hadn't disappeared. You can imagine the weight Athena must have felt in those moments, can't you? To have cast someone aside, to have made a decision that would forever change a life, only to have that decision haunt you for eternity. Athena had not seen Medusa as a person, but as an objective pawn in her own divine game. She hadn't expected Medusa's transformation to evoke such strength, such defiance. Medusa had become more than just a victim of Athena's curse. She had become a symbol of everything Athena had tried to suppress: rebellion, defiance, and the strength of those cast aside. The gods might have ruled over mortals, but Medusa had proven that even the most broken, cursed creature could become a force to be reckoned with. And as Medusa's fury grew, Athena could no longer ignore the consequences of her actions. The curse she had cast had not just altered Medusa, had altered the balance of power between gods and mortals. For the first time, Athena was forced to confront the possibility that her divine judgment had been flawed. Perseus, the hero chosen by the gods to end Medusa's reign of terror, would soon come to Athena for guidance, as though he were the one who held the power to end this chapter. But the truth was, Athena's power had never been absolute, and it was about to be challenged by the very creature she had discarded. Athena stood in the stillness of her temple, her divine form bathed in the cool light of her own wisdom. The weight of what she had done hung in the air around her. The gods, with all their power and grace, could not escape the consequences of their actions. Athena had chosen the path of justice, the path of divine wrath, but in doing so, she had created a storm that even she could not control. The goddess had always believed that justice was cold, precise, and without mercy. But now, as she stood alone in the quiet of her temple, she began to question that belief. Had she been too quick to judge? Had she condemned Medusa without truly understanding the depths of her pain? The cold justice she had once trusted seemed less certain now, less clear. Perseus was nearing the cave where Medusa waited, unaware of the turmoil brewing in the mind of the goddess who had set everything in motion. The hero, the gods' chosen vessel of justice, was about to face a monster who had once been a woman who had been cast aside by a divine hand. Athena had sent Perseus to end Medusa's suffering, but what if that suffering had not been Medusa's alone? Athena's mind raced with the consequences of her decision. What if, in her attempt to punish Medusa, she had doomed both herself and the world? What if the curse that had transformed Medusa had also transformed Athena in ways she had not foreseen? Could it be that the goddess of wisdom had been wrong? Could it be that in her quest for justice, she had created something far more powerful than she had intended? The thought gnawed at Athena. The truth was, she wasn't sure what would happen when Perseus faced Medusa. Would the hero succeed in killing the monster, as the gods had foretold? Or would Medusa's strength, her will to survive, be enough to change the course of fate? Athena was a goddess of wisdom, yes, but even she could not see the future clearly anymore. The threads of fate, once so easily woven into the tapestry of her designs, had begun to unravel, and now she had to face the possibility that the justice she had dispensed had come with a cost far greater than she had ever imagined. The winds howled through the halls of Athena's temple, carrying with them whispers of old, forgotten rivalries. Even the gods were not immune to the tensions that simmered beneath the surface of their immortal existence. Athena, for all her wisdom, could not escape the ancient grudges that had been woven into the very fabric of the divine world. The gods were not simply beings of light and power. They were also beings of egos, pride, and jealousy. And those emotions, those ancient feelings, would shape the fate of Medusa in ways no one had anticipated. You can feel the weight of that tension, can't you? The air thick with unsaid words, with the silent pull of old alliances and feuds. For centuries, Athena had stood as one of the most powerful and respected gods in the pantheon, but her power was not unchallenged. There were those who envied her position, who resented the influence she wielded over both mortals and gods alike. Medusa's curse was not just an isolated act of divine judgment. It was the culmination of a larger, more complex struggle for dominance within the celestial realm. Historians still argue over the true nature of Athena's relationships with the other gods. Some believe that her rivalry with Poseidon, the god of the seas, was the catalyst for Medusa's transformation. According to some versions of the myth, Poseidon had fallen in love with Medusa, and their affair in Athena's temple had angered the goddess beyond measure. Athena, the embodiment of wisdom and justice, could not allow such an act to go unpunished. But what if there was more to it than that? What if the rivalry between Athena and Poseidon had deepened over the years, reaching a boiling point in Medusa's story? It is easy to think of the gods as distant, untouchable beings, far removed from the struggles of mortals. But their lives were entangled with the same petty disputes and jealousies that plagued human existence. Poseidon had been a powerful force in his own right, and his anger at Athena's decision to punish Medusa had been swift and brutal. Poseidon's influence would not be easily dismissed, and his wrath would echo through the ages, rippling out from the moment Medusa was cursed. But it wasn't just Poseidon who had a stake in Medusa's fate. There were other gods who had watched Athena's actions with suspicion, even envy. Some believed that Athena had overstepped her bounds by condemning Medusa, that her decision was not a just one, but an act of petty revenge. Hera, the queen of the gods, had always been a shrewd observer of divine politics, and even she had her doubts about Athena's methods. Though she never openly challenged Athena's power, Hera's silence spoke volumes. The tension between the gods was more than just politics. It was personal. Athena had spent centuries cultivating her image as the protector of justice, as the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. But in the eyes of the other gods, Athena's perfection was a double-edged sword. Her very sense of justice made her seem arrogant, unyielding, and even cold. Her actions toward Medusa had only reinforced that perception. Athena had not acted out of a sense of fairness. She had acted out of her own pride, her own need to maintain control. In the quiet moments between the clash of gods and mortals, you can almost hear the echoes of those ancient rivalriest ones that had shaped the decisions of the gods and set the stage for Medusa's fate. The gods were not simply divine beings who ruled over the world with benevolence. They were driven by their own desires and vendettas. Athena's decision to curse Medusa had not been an isolated act. It was part of a larger, unspoken war for supremacy within the pantheon. Historians still argue whether the gods' interference in the mortal world was a reflection of their true nature, or whether it was a projection of their internal struggles. Some claim that the gods, in their vast power, were too disconnected from the lives of mortals to truly understand the consequences of their actions. Others believe that the gods meddling in mortal affairs was a direct result of their internal conflicts, or reflection of their insecurities, their jealousy, and their thirst for dominance. And as Athena stood alone in her temple, contemplating the consequences of her actions, she could not escape the truth that had always been there. The gods were as flawed as the mortals they ruled. Medusa's fate had been decided not by divine justice alone, but by the simmering tensions between the gods, each one pulling the strings of fate to serve their own interests. Medusa had become a pawn in that divine game that was far more complicated than Athena had ever realized. The goddess of wisdom had thought herself in control, but now, as she looked at the outcome of her decision, she saw that the forces at play were far beyond her understanding. Athena had played her part, but in doing so, she had unwittingly triggered a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the gods' power. And it wasn't just Medusa who would suffer the consequences. The gods, too, would have to face the fallout of their rivalry their pride, and their unrelenting thirst for dominance. The balance of power was shifting, and Medusa's curse was only the beginning. The moment was nearing. Perseus, the hero chosen by the gods, was drawing closer to Medusa's lair. Athena had set the stage, providing him with all the divine tools he needed to succeed. A shield that reflected light, a sword that could sever any bond, sandals that could carry him across the sky. All of these gifts were meant to ensure that Perseus would accomplish his divine mission to kill Medusa, the monster who had been born of a goddess's wrath. But what the gods had not anticipated was the shifting tide that had already begun. The boundaries between gods and mortals were more fragile than they had ever been. Medusa was no longer the helpless victim of Athena's curse. She was a force of nature in her own right, her anger and power growing with every passing moment. And as the gods' chosen hero prepared for his final confrontation, Medusa stood at the precipice, ready to face her fate in her terms. You feel it too, don't you? The tension in the air, the way everything seems to be hanging by a thread, like the moment just before a storm breaks. The gods and mortals had always been separate, one ruling from the heavens, the other struggling to carve out their place on earth. But now, the lines between them were blurring. Medusa had already shattered the illusion of the gods' absolute power. Athena's curse, though meant to be a punishment, had instead given Medusa the power to reshape her own destiny. Perseus was not a fool. He knew the legends of Medusa, how she had been a beautiful mortal, cursed by a goddess's jealousy. He knew that to face her was to face death itself. But he had no choice. The gods had set him on this path, and he would follow it, no matter the cost. What he didn't realize, however, was that he wasn't just battling a monster. He was battling the very essence of divine intervention, the unintended consequences of his gods meddling. The gods, in their infinite wisdom, had not accounted for the most human of traits, the will to survive. Medusa's transformation had not merely been the result of Athena's wrath. It had been a response to the cruelty of the gods themselves. Medusa, through her curse, had become more than just a victim. She had become a survivor. And now, as Perseus drew closer, she was ready to make him understand that survival was no simple matter. You know how it is in stories like Theseus. Hero faces the monster fights back, and the two are locked in a struggle that seems to define the world itself. But this wasn't just a simple confrontation between hero and villain. It was the clash of gods and mortals, of power and survival. Medusa had been transformed into a creature of myth, but she still remembered what it was like to be human. Perseus was not just a pawn in Athena's game. He was a mortal who had been forced into the position of the hero, and in the clash between them, neither would be able to avoid the cosmic weight of their fates. Historians still argue over how the battle between Perseus and Medusa went down. Some claim that Perseus, aided by Athena's shield, was able to avoid Medusa's deadly gaze, sneaking up on her in the darkness. Others suggest that it wasn't just Perseus's skill, or the gods' gifts that allowed him to succeed, was the sheer inevitability of fate. The gods had decided that Medusa's time was up, and no matter how strong or determined she was, fate would not be denied. But you have to wonder, was Medusa truly defeated? Or did she simply fall into the role that the gods had carved out for her? Was she the monster they needed to destroy? Or was she a symbol of the gods' failure to understand the consequences of their power? Perhaps in the moment when Perseus raised his sword to strike her down, Medusa was not just fighting for her own survival, she was fighting for something far larger than herself. She was fighting against the system that had created her, against the gods who had shaped her destiny. The clash wasn't just physical. It was a battle of ideologies, a confrontation between those who believed they were chosen by the gods and those who had been cast aside by them. Perseus, with his divine armor and weapons, represented the will of the gods, their belief in justice, their right to impose their vision of order on the world. Medusa, with her twisted form and vengeful heart, represented the rebellion of those who had been discarded by the gods to mortals, who had learned the hard way that their lives were nothing but tools for divine manipulation. And in that moment, as Perseus struck the final blow, the clash between gods and mortals reached its crescendo. The gods may have thought they had won, that their hero had succeeded in fulfilling their will. But the truth was, the cost of that victory would be felt for generations. Medusa's death was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of something far greater. As Perseus stood over Medusa's lifeless form, the air seemed to thicken. The gods had won their battle, but they had lost something much more important. Medusa had proven that, even in the face of divine power, there was still room for defiance, for survival, for the human spirit to rise against the tide. She had shown the gods that their control was not as absolute as they believed. In the end, it was the gods who had been defeated not by Medusa's power, but by their own arrogance. The world had already shifted by the time Perseus approached the motionless form of Medusa. The air was thick, heavy with the silent hum of divine consequences. It wasn't just the weight of the task at hand, it was the realization that what lay before him wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. Medusa, despite her grotesque form, and the horror she instilled in others, was not simply the villain in this story. She had become something else, something tragic, something misunderstood, something far beyond what Athena had intended. But for Perseus, the task remained clear. He raised his sword, the gleaming blade now almost glowing in the moonlight. The gods had chosen him for this moment, had given him everything he needed to succeed. Athena's shield, reflecting the light as he gazed into it, offered him a way to face Medusa without being turned to stone. The tools, the divine weapons, had been granted with the expectation that the hero would fulfill his destiny. Medusa had to die yet. As Perseus stood over her, it was impossible not to feel the weight of that destiny, the weight of what was about to happen. He had been taught by the gods to see Medusa as nothing more than a monster, a creation of divine punishment, a symbol of what could happen when one defied the gods. But now, looking down at her, there was something else in his heart. Historians debate whether Perseus ever truly understood the tragedy of what he was about to do. Was he simply carrying out his divine orders, or did he, in some small part, recognize the weight of his actions? Did he understand that, in ending Medusa's life, he was not only fulfilling Athena's will, but also silencing the last remnants of a soul that had been shattered by divine cruelty? You feel the conflict in his chest, don't you? The hesitation. The gods had made it clear, was their instrument, and to defy them would be to defy fate itself. Medusa was to be slain, and with her death, he would be a hero. The gods would sing his praises, and he would claim his place among the immortals. But in that moment, standing above her, the reality of what that victory would mean became too much to bear. Medusa's lifeless body lay before him, a tragic symbol of divine intervention gone wrong. She had been a beautiful mortal once, loved and adored by gods and men alike. But now, she was nothing more than a trophy, her head to be severed and delivered to King Perseus. The gods had orchestrated this from the beginning, and Perseus was merely a pawn in their game. The blow came swiftly, the sword cutting through the air with the precision of divine craftsmanship. The head of Medusa, once a symbol of beauty and grace, now fell to the ground with a sickening thud. Perseus stood still for a moment, the weight of the act sinking in. What had he really achieved? Historians still wonder whether Perseus truly understood what he had done. Was he merely a pawn in Athena's grand design? Or did he see that Medusa's death was not a triumph? Was her curse really her fault? Or had she simply been the victim of a divine world that played with the lives of mortals as easily as chess pieces? The severed head of Medusa lay before him, her snakes still writhing in their eternal torment. Perseus had won the battle, but he had not won the war. The gods may have claimed victory, but the cost was something far more profound. Medusa's death was the end of a tragic story, but it was also a beginning that would echo through the ages. The head, still dripping with the blood of the goddess's curse, would become a trophy, a symbol of Perseus's heroism, but it would also serve as a reminder. The gods had set everything in motion, but they had underestimated the consequences of their actions. Medusa's death had sealed her fate, but it had also sealed the fate of the gods. For with every act of divine cruelty, the gods had chipped away at their own power. Perseus held the severed head aloft, ready to return to King Polydex with the prize he had been promised. The gods would reward him, as they always did, for completing their tasks. But in the quiet space between the killing blow and the return to the mortal world, Perseus could feel something change inside him. Medusa had not been a monster, she had been a tragic figure, someone whose life had been shaped by forces beyond her control. The gods had created her downfall, and Perseus had merely played his part. The gods had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The journey back was not as triumphant as Perseus had imagined. He had done what the gods had asked, followed their divine orders to the letter. He had slain Medusa, taken her head, and delivered it as a trophy. But with every step he took away from the cave, away from the place where Medusa had breathed her last, the weight of what he had done seemed to grow heavier. The gods had given him their blessings, their power, their weapons. They had set him on this path, and now they would celebrate his victory. But there was no celebration in Perseus's heart. It wasn't just the head he carried that troubled him. It was the look in Medusa's eyes, the way she had seemed almost resigned to her fate, as if she knew what was coming long before Perseus ever raised his sword. Medusa's story was not just one of tragedy. It was a story of loss, of a life stolen by divine jealousy, and of a woman who had fought with all her might to hold on to whatever humanity she had left. Perseus had been a mere instrument of that divine judgment, and now he was left with the consequences. Historians debate the true effect that Medusa's death had on Perseus. Some believe that the hero, once so eager to prove his worth, became a different man after the slaying. The gods had promised him glory, but it was a hollow glory, a glory tainted by the knowledge that his victory had been built on the suffering of another. Others argue that Perseus never truly understood the weight of his actions, that he saw himself as a mere tool of fate, a hero who fulfilled his divine destiny without ever questioning the motives behind it. But you can feel the dissonance, can't you? The way Perseus's chest grows heavy with each passing day, the way the glory he once craved feels like a distant memory. He had come to slay Medusa, to claim the title of hero. But in the end, it wasn't her death that defined him. It was the realization that the gods' will had forced him into a role that was never truly his own. He had killed a woman who had been cursed by the gods, a woman who had become more than just a monster's, had become a symbol of everything wrong with divine justice. The gods, with all their power, had not seen the cost of their decisions. They had not understood that Medusa's death would reverberate far beyond the moment her head was severed. They had not understood that their manipulation of mortal lives would create ripple effects that they could never control. Perseus, in his youthful arrogance, had believed he was fulfilling the will of the gods. But now, as he looked at the severed head in his hand, he began to see the cracks in the gods' perfect order. What would the gods do now that Medusa was dead? Would they be satisfied? Would they feel justice had been done? Or would they be confronted with the truth that Medusa's curse had been more than just a punishment? It had been a reflection of their own failings. As Perseus made his way back to Polydex, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The world that had once seemed so simply the world where the gods were infallible where heroes were always victorious, was no longer as clear. There was a part of him, deep inside, that understood that no victory could truly come from such a loss. Medusa's death, though seemingly a triumph, had been a sacrifice that not only affected her, but also the gods who had condemned her. The gods had won this battle, but in doing so, they had lost something far more important, their ability to truly understand the consequences of their actions, and the world, as it always did, had moved on. Medusa's death would fade into legend, a story told and retold, but it would never be truly forgotten. Her legacy, born of divine cruelty, would live on in the hearts of those who had once known her as a woman, not a monster, as Perseus delivered Medusa's head to Polydex. He did not feel the satisfaction of a hero. Instead, he felt the weight of a world that had been irrevocably changed by the decisions of gods and mortals alike. The gods had won their victory, but they had also sown the seeds of something much darker. Historians still argue whether Perseus ever came to fully understand the consequences of his actions. Some claim that he lived out his life unaware of the true cost of Medusa's death, while others believe that, in his later years, Perseus would come to realize the terrible weight of the gods' manipulation. In the end, no matter how the story is told, one thing is certain: the gods, for all their power, had never been in control of the story they had set in motion. The gods' victory was a hollow one, and Medusa's legacy was far from finished. The gods are often portrayed as untouchable beings, as forces beyond the comprehension of mortals, but they, too, are prisoners of their own actions. Athena, wise and revered as the goddess of reason, was no exception to this truth. The consequences of her curse upon Medusa's monstrous transformation, the isolation, the inevitable death had reverberated far beyond her control. What Athena had believed to be an act of divine justice, a punishment for Medusa's transgression, had turned into a tragedy of cosmic proportions, leaving a ripple of regret that echoed through her immortal soul. You can feel it, can't you? That weight of regret, the knowledge that Athena could not escape what she had done. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, had been so certain in her judgment. Medusa, she had believed, deserved punishment for the sin she had committed in Athena's sacred temple. But in the quiet aftermath, Athena began to see things differently. She had expected the curse to silence Medusa, to erase the woman's beauty and her rebellious spirit. But what had really been silenced was Athena's own understanding of justice, her own sense of right and wrong. Athena's regret was not a simple matter of feeling sorry for Medusa. It was the weight of understanding the depths of her own actions, the understanding that she had unleashed a tragedy far greater than she had ever anticipated. Medusa had not been just a victim. She had been a person. She had been someone who, before her curse, had been loved, admired, and full of life. The same power Athena had used to strike her down had been the very force that had obliterated Medusa's humanity. Historians still debate whether Athena ever truly felt remorse for Medusa's fate. Some believe that Athena's regret was deep and genuine, a reflection of her own growing understanding that the consequences of her actions were not just limited to Medusa's suffering. Others argue that Athena's regret was more a reflection of the complexity of the gods' existence, a reflection of their constant struggle between their divine duties and their mortal emotions. Regardless of the depth of her regret, one thing is clear: Athena could no longer deny the truth that had settled in her heart. The goddess stood in the stillness of her temple, the place where it had all begun. The pillars rose high around her, each one a silent witness to her decisions. The whispers of the wind seemed to carry the weight of her thoughts, and for the first time in an eternity, Athena allowed herself to feel the guilt that had been building within her for so long. You can feel the shift, can't you? That subtle change in the air as Athena stands there, no longer the unshakable deity of wisdom, but something more vulnerable, more human in her own way. The regret was not just about Medusa's death. It was about her own role in the larger story of divine cruelty, how the gods played with the lives of mortals without ever considering the consequences of their actions. Athena had believed that she was above human emotions, above the petty squabbles and weaknesses of mortals. She had prided herself on her wisdom, on her ability to make decisions based on what she believed was right. But now, as she reflected on the devastation that had unfolded because of her actions, she realized that even the gods could be blinded by their own pride. Athena had not been immune to the flaws of her kind. In trying to enforce justice, she had instead become an instrument of destruction. Historians debate whether Athena's regret was a permanent change, or a fleeting moment of self-awareness. Some suggest that her regret was short-lived, that the weight of the gods' immortal lives made it impossible for them to truly learn from their mistakes. Others argue that Athena's regret was a turning point, a moment in which she began to understand the true complexity of the world she had shaped. Either way, one thing remained true. Athena had been forever altered by Medusa's death. As Perseus stood with the severed head of Medusa, ready to present it as a trophy, Athena's mind was clouded with the knowledge of the destruction she had helped bring about. She had once seen herself as a goddess of wisdom, a bringer of justice to the world. But now, all she could see was the damage that had been done. Medusa's death had not been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of a new understanding of power, of what it meant to be a god who ruled over mortals. Athena's regret did not change the past. Medusa was still gone, her life extinguished by the wrath of a goddess who had not truly understood the cost of her power. But it was a turning point. For the first time, Athena began to question the divine order she had helped to maintain for so long. She had always believed that gods held ultimate control, that their judgments were beyond reproach. But now, she could no longer ignore the truth that had always been there. Thought the gods, too, were subject to their own emotions, their own flaws, their own mistakes. In the end, Medusa's death was not just the death of a mortal woman, it was the death of a divine illusion. The gods, for all their power, were not above the consequences of their actions. They were not immune to the suffering they caused. And as Athena stood in the stillness of her temple, the weight of that truth pressed down on her like a heavy stone. Medusa's legacy would not fade. It would live on in the hearts of those who had known her, in the souls of those who had seen her, not as a monster, but as a woman who had been wronged by the gods. And in Athena's heart, it would remain as the reminder of the consequences of divine power unchecked. Now, the gods would have to live with what they had created, and Medusa, in her death, had become something far more than just a symbol of divine wrath. She had become the beginning of a new understanding, a new reckoning for the gods.